I can still hear the sound of applause that night, the kind that feels like thunder when it isn't meant for you. I stood at the back of the hall, my palms trembling, my heart pounding as the banner unfurled. The Grace Haven Center, founded by Grace Turner. My name wasn't there. Not a single trace. Just weeks ago, Grace and I had toasted over tea, laughing like schoolgirls as I told her my dream was finally coming true. She promised she'd handle the business registration, said she'd make things easier. Now, she stood on that stage, my best friend of 40 years, beaming as cameras flashed. My dream, my money, my purpose all wearing her name. The audience rose for a standing ovation. Grace smiled at me across the room, calm, radiant, like she'd done nothing wrong. In that instant, something inside me fractured. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet snap that no one heard but me. After the ceremony, people swarmed her, offering congratulations, shaking her hand, praising her brilliance. I waited in the corner, numb, hoping she'd glance my way. She didn't. It was as if I'd ceased to exist. "Eleanor," someone whispered behind me. "I thought this was your idea." I turned, but before I could answer, Grace approached, arms wide, voice dripping warmth. "There you are," she exclaimed, kissing my cheek like a mother consoling a child. "Can you believe it? We did it. We." Her perfume made me dizzy. My throat burned. I wanted to scream, but the room was filled with people I'd known for decades, neighbors, old friends. If I caused a scene, I'd only confirm her new narrative, that poor Eleanor was bitter and confused. So I smiled. I let her hug me, but I whispered, so only she could hear, "You stole from me." Her grip tightened. "I built it," she said softly. "You just dreamed." And then she pulled away and raised her champagne glass to the crowd. I didn't sleep that night. Every word, every smile, every moment of that event replayed in my head like a cruel film. I checked the documents she'd filed, every one signed by her alone. She'd changed the ownership months ago. I'd been so trusting I hadn't noticed. The next morning, I confronted her at her house. She opened the door wearing silk, sipping coffee, pretending surprise. "Eleanor, darling, it's early." "Don't you darling me." My voice shook. "You took everything." She sighed, setting down her cup. "You should have read the forms. I only protected the business from your impulsiveness." "My impulsiveness?" I laughed bitterly. "You mean my trust." She looked me in the eye, calm as stone. "You've always needed someone to guide you. Be grateful I'm that person." That was when I realized the depth of her delusion. Grace believed her lies. She didn't think she'd betrayed me. She thought she'd saved me. The weeks that followed were the longest of my life. Grace held interviews, appeared in local papers, and even gave a talk about resilience in aging women. Each headline was a knife. I tried to explain to others, but no one wanted to believe me. Grace would never, they said. She's done so much for this town. Even my son, Daniel, grew distant. "Mom," he said one night over the phone, "maybe you misunderstood the arrangement." I hung up before I cried. At 67, I'd become the town's whisper. They said grief had made me paranoid. They said I was jealous. But inside, I wasn't jealous, I was hollow. I'd lost my purpose, my savings, and the only friend I thought I could die trusting. Grace had taken my story and rewritten me as the villain. So, I did the only thing left to do. I vanished. I left without telling anyone, not even Daniel. Packed what little I had left into my old sedan, and drove until the town faded in the rearview mirror. The radio was silent. I didn't want music. I found a quiet coastal town 3 hours away, somewhere no one knew my name, where I could start over without the shadow of Grace Turner looming over me. For months, I kept to myself. I worked at a small flower shop, rented a single-room apartment by the sea, and lived off what remained of my savings. Every morning, I'd walk along the water, whispering the same vow to the wind. She will not be the end of me. I didn't want revenge, not yet. I wanted to remember who I was before her. But as the seasons turned, something began to shift inside me. For the first time, I didn't cry when I saw the ocean. For the first time, I started to imagine what rebuilding might look like. It started with a notebook. One morning, I sat by the ocean, the mist curling around me, and began to write. Not letters or plans, just memories. Every betrayal, every red flag I'd ignored, every time Grace had guided me into silence. By the end of that week, the pages were full. Writing her name no longer made my hands shake. It made them steady. At the flower shop, I met women who reminded me of myself, tired, unseen, carrying quiet heartbreaks. They came for roses but stayed to talk. One afternoon, a widow named June said, "I wish there was a place where women like us could just breathe." Something in me stirred. That night, I opened my notebook again. What if I built that place, not a business? A refugee's paperwork to steal. No spotlight to crave, just a space built on healing, not ego. I smiled for the first time in months. The sea roared in the distance like applause meant only for me. I found an abandoned cafe near the harbor. Cracked windows, peeling paint, but bones strong enough to hold a dream. The owner was an old fisherman's widow who said, "You want it? Take it. I'm too tired to care what happens to it." I gave her the last of my savings, signed my name, and walked through the dust like it was sacred ground. Every corner whispered possibility. I scrubbed floors until my knees ached, painted walls pale blue, and filled the air with lavender. By winter, it had become Harbolite Haven, a small community space for women starting over. We hosted teas, workshops, quiet moments of grief, and laughter. And somehow, people began to notice. A local journalist visited, wrote an article calling it the heart of the coast. I cut it out and taped it to the wall. Not once did I think of Grace. But fate has a cruel sense of timing, because just when you stop looking back, the past finds a way to knock on your door. Her voice came through the radio first. I was arranging tulips in a vase when I heard it. Smooth, confident, perfectly rehearsed. Grace Turner, founder of the Grace Haven Center, joins us today to discuss her expansion plans and upcoming book tour. My fingers froze. The vase slipped, water spilling across the counter. Her laugh echoed through the small shop, the same one that used to make me feel safe. Now it made my skin crawl. She spoke about empowering older women, about her vision, about how betrayal has no place among true friends. The interviewer called her an inspiration. I turned the radio off. For a long time, I just stood there, trembling, feeling the familiar sting of humiliation rising again. But then, I exhaled, let her speak, because the louder she talked, the more cracks would appear in her perfect image. And I knew something she didn't. The truth always whispers before it screams. Months passed. Grace's empire began to expand, but beneath the surface, her charm was thinning. I heard whispers through old acquaintances who still thought I'd moved abroad. "Grace's staff keeps quitting," one woman said over tea. "She's difficult, paranoid even." I smiled politely and said nothing. Meanwhile, Harbolite Haven flourished quietly. We had no investors, no advertising, just word of mouth and heart. Every woman who walked through our doors left lighter than she came. Some called me a healer. Others just called me kind. But I knew what I was, free. One evening, while closing up, I looked at the faded article about Grace's success taped to the counter from years before. Then I slid a new one beside it. Local Haven wins award for empowering women over 50.no names. No faces, just truth. And for the first time, I realized my story didn't need to end in revenge. But fate, once again, had other plans. Grace found me. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when she walked through the door of Harbolite Haven. I knew her before she even spoke. The scent of her perfume, the click of her heels. Time had not been kind. Her once perfect posture had bent slightly, her eyes sharper but emptier. "Eleanor," she said, voice trembling between surprise and calculation. "You're alive." "More than alive," I replied. She scanned the place, the flowers, the women laughing softly in the corner, the article on the wall. "So this is what you've been doing," she said. "Starting over." I nodded. "Without your help." Her mouth tightened. "You could have told me." "We could have, Grace," I interrupted gently. "You stole from me." For the first time, she didn't deny it. She just looked tired. "I thought you'd forgive me by now," she whispered. I smiled, calm as the tide. "Oh, I did. But forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's remembering differently." Her eyes darkened. And I knew the story was just beginning again. After she left, I sat for a long time, staring at the door she'd closed behind her. It wasn't anger I felt. It was grief for the woman I once trusted, the woman who had known every version of me and still chose to destroy me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Grace's face haunted me, not because of what she'd done, but because of what she'd lost: peace. The next morning, a letter arrived from a journalist who'd visited Harbolite Haven months ago. She wanted to feature our work in a national magazine, a story on women rebuilding from betrayal. The irony wasn't lost on me. I agreed. When the interview began, she asked what inspired me. I looked straight at her camera and said, sometimes the people who break you only teach you how to rebuild stronger. It wasn't about revenge, not yet. But the seed was planted, and I knew the roots of truth would find their way to Grace eventually. The article went viral. It wasn't loud or flashy, it was real. Thousands of women wrote in, saying they saw themselves in the story. Some shared photos, others shared tears. Harbolite Haven became a movement. And though I never mentioned her name, those who knew us began connecting the dots. Grace's charm had always been her shield, but now whispers began to surface. I never confirmed nor denied anything. I didn't have to. Truth, once awakened, does the walking on its own. A month later, a local paper ran a headline: Community questions Grace Haven's origins amid fraud allegations. I didn't buy the paper. I didn't celebrate. Instead, I brewed tea, stood by the window, and whispered, "You did this to yourself." That night, my phone rang. Unknown number. When I answered, all I heard was her voice, shaking, defensive, angry. "How could you?" she hissed. "I didn't," I said softly. "You just finally got seen." The weeks that followed were heavy with silence. Grace stopped appearing in public. Her staff left. Sponsors withdrew. Her book deal, the one she'd stolen my outline for, was quietly canceled. But I didn't gloat. Revenge wasn't supposed to taste like victory. It was supposed to taste like peace. And yet, peace felt hollow. I'd lost 40 years of friendship, 40 years of laughter and shared dreams. When I saw her name trending online, this time for the wrong reasons, my chest ached, not with triumph, but with mourning. That night, I walked to the sea again, the same shore where I'd first written in my notebook. The waves whispered like old friends. I did what I had to, I said aloud. The ocean didn't answer, but I could feel its approval. Quiet, steady, relentless. The tide never seeks revenge. It simply returns to claim what was always its own. I thought it was over, until Grace showed up again. This time not in arrogance, but in desperation. She stood in the rain outside Harbolite, drenched and shaking. "I have nowhere else to go," she said. "They've taken everything." For a moment, I almost closed the door. But something in her voice stopped me, the quiver of someone who finally understood loss. I let her in. We sat in silence, the smell of rain and old memories filling the air. "I never meant to hurt you," she said finally. "I just wanted to matter." Tears welled in her eyes. For the first time, I saw not the villain, but the frightened woman beneath the mask. "You mattered to me," I said quietly. "You didn't need to steal that." She sobbed. And though forgiveness still felt far away, I realized this was her punishment, not what I did to her, but what she did to herself. Grace left before dawn. On the counter, she'd placed an envelope. Inside was a single sentence written in her careful, looping script: "You were always the better woman." No signature, no apology, just truth, finally unclothed. Months passed, and Harbolite Haven grew beyond me. A movement now led by women I'd once helped heal. They called me the heart behind the vision. I preferred to think of myself as the wound that became wisdom. One spring morning, I stood at the ribbon cutting of our new facility. Cameras flashed. Reporters asked questions. Among the crowd, I saw her, Grace. She didn't approach, didn't speak. Just stood there, older, smaller somehow, but watching with something like pride. Our eyes met. I nodded once. She nodded back. Words were needed. Because sometimes revenge doesn't come in flames or fury. It comes in silence. And that silence was everything I had ever wanted. There are two kinds of peace, the one that soothes and the one that silences. For months, I lived in the latter. Harbolite Haven flourished, but I had begun to feel like a ghost within my own creation. Every decision was followed by a question that lived only in my mind. Would Grace have done it differently? I hated that she still lingered there, even after everything. One evening, as I packed up from the office, I found an old photo of us, laughing over paint-stained tables during the first mural we made together. Our smiles were real then, untouched by jealousy or lies. I sat there for an hour, staring at the image, realizing that forgiveness isn't always given to others. Sometimes it's a mercy you grant yourself. So that night, I whispered to the air, I forgive you, Grace. Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve to breathe again. And I did. Forgiveness didn't erase the past. It simply loosened its grip. I began hosting story nights at Harbolite, where women told their truths, unfiltered, unpolished. There were tears, laughter, and sometimes silence that said more than words ever could. It became our ritual. One night, as the room emptied, I noticed a familiar face at the back. Grace again, quiet, almost unrecognizable. She waited until everyone had gone before walking up to me. Do you ever wish things had been different? She asked. Her voice was softer now, stripped of pride. I met her gaze. Every day, I said. But maybe they had to happen this way for both of us to find who we were without each other. She nodded slowly. I'm trying to start again, she murmured. Then start small, I said. Start honest. And as she left, I felt something inside me shift. Not pain, not relief, but a quiet recognition that healing doesn't always mean reunion. Sometimes it just means letting the past stand where it belongs, behind you. Autumn came, wrapping the world in gold. The sea outside my window turned a deeper shade of gray, the same color as the hair I no longer bothered to dye. One morning, I received a letter. No name, no return address, just a single sentence in Grace's handwriting. I'm leaving the country. Thank you for teaching me what honesty feels like. I read it 3 times, then folded it neatly and placed it beside the photo of us. I didn't cry. Instead, I brewed tea, stepped out onto the porch, and watched the tide draw near. The gulls screamed over the water, their cries echoing like memories that refused to fade completely. Grace had been both my ruin and my resurrection, and perhaps that's what she was meant to be. Some people enter your life to teach you how to love, others to teach you how to survive loving them. Years later, I became the story people told to describe resilience. Magazines called me the woman who turned betrayal into legacy. But none of them knew the nights I spent talking to ghosts. I often dreamed of her, Grace standing on that cliff, smiling, wind in her hair, like nothing had ever gone wrong. In my dreams, I always reached for her, and she always disappeared just before I could touch her hand. One winter evening, I received a small package from a return address in Florence. Inside was a leather notebook, blank except for the first page, for Eleanor, the friend I destroyed but never stopped admiring. It was signed, finally, Grace. I traced her name with trembling fingers. There were no tears this time, only an ache, deep but clean. The kind that says it's done. The sea has aged with me. I sit here now, years later, on the same shore where I first built Harbolite Haven from heartbreak and silence. The women who once came broken now lead empires, families, and foundations. They call me the matriarch of survival. But I still see myself as the woman who once lost everything and chose to rise, not for revenge, but for meaning. When the wind moves just right, I still hear her laughter carried over the waves. And in some strange way, I know she hears mine too. Maybe we were never enemies, just 2 women trying to be seen, both flawed, both human. I close my eyes as the tide touches my feet. I forgive us, I whisper. And with that, the waves pull away, soft, certain, eternal. Some stories don't end with justice or redemption. Some simply end with peace. The older I grew, the quieter my victories became. People came to Harbolite to heal, and I realized I'd built what I once needed, a place where broken hearts could rest without shame. I started writing a memoir, though not for publication. It was simply titled The Things We Survive. Every page felt like a confession, every line a small release. In one chapter I wrote, betrayal doesn't end your story. It edits it painfully, beautifully, but never permanently. Sometimes the women would find me sitting by the fire, pen in hand, eyes closed. They thought I was praying. Maybe I was. Not to a god, but to the version of myself that had once believed friendship could never turn to ashes. I thanked her for being naive enough to love and strong enough to rise when that love was shattered. 22,222. Winter turned to spring, and Harbolite hosted its 10th anniversary. There were speeches, laughter, and photographs. But amid the celebration, I noticed a new guest, a young woman with Grace's eyes. She waited until the crowd thinned before approaching me. "You don't know me," she said softly. "I'm Claire, Grace's granddaughter." I felt my breath catch. She handed me an envelope. "My grandmother asked me to bring this to you if she ever passed." For a moment, time folded in on itself. I took the letter, trembling. Grace had been gone 3 months. Peacefully, her granddaughter said. That night, I sat in my study, firelight flickering across the paper, and opened it. The handwriting was frail but familiar. "Eleanor, I finally learned that envy is just love gone rotten. I'm sorry it took me a lifetime to say this, but you were always the better of us both." I didn't finish reading before the tears came. Grief doesn't always come from loss. Sometimes it comes from relief. Grace's apology felt like an old wound sighing closed. I spent the night on the porch, her letter on my lap, the ocean humming like it understood. In the morning, I gathered every trace of her, the photograph, the notebook, the first flyer of Grace Haven, and placed them in a wooden box. I walked it to the edge of the water, the same place where we once planned our dream. The tide was low, the sky just waking. I whispered, "Goodbye, Grace," and released the box into the waves. It floated for a moment, then sank quietly beneath the surface. I watched until it was gone. The wind caught my hair and I smiled. She had stolen my dream, but in some way, she also gave me the strength to make it real. Without her betrayal, Harbolite would never have existed, and I might never have found myself. Years later, my memoir was discovered after I was gone. Claire found it among my papers, sealed with a note, "For the women who have ever been silenced, betrayed, or forgotten, may you find your light again." She published it under its original title, "The Things We Survive." It became a quiet sensation, passed between women in coffee shops, whispered about in support groups, quoted in classrooms. Readers said it didn't feel like a revenge story, it felt like a resurrection. They said Eleanor Hayes reminded them that strength isn't loud, and healing isn't always visible. Sometimes it's just the decision to keep breathing, to keep believing in yourself when everyone else has stopped. And somewhere in Florence, in an old cemetery by the hills, a small white flower began to bloom on Grace Turner's grave, one Claire planted after finishing the book. She called it Eleanor's Bloom. If this were someone else's story, perhaps it would end with applause or retribution. But mine ends with quiet, the kind that follows understanding. I learned that forgiveness isn't weakness. It's the last form of freedom left to those who have been wronged. Grace once took everything I thought defined me, my money, my dream, my dignity. But she never took the one thing she couldn't understand, my ability to rebuild. My revenge wasn't about making her fall. It was about proving I could rise and stay risen. If she were here now, I think she'd smile and say, "You did it, Ellie." And I'd reply, "No, we did. You just helped most painfully." The waves kissed my ankles again, cold and certain. I looked toward the horizon, where the sun spills over the sea like gold. For the first time in years, I feel whole. And somewhere deep in the wind, I swear I hear her whisper back, "You found the life we both lost."